Hi everyone. Tonight, we step into the echoing stone corridors of a medieval castle. Torches flicker along the walls, and you can almost hear the faint whistle of wind sneaking through the cracks in heavy wooden doors. It's a scene that feels romantic as a visitor. But if you actually had to live here, especially on a winter night, regret would set in before the hour was up. The truth is simple. Castles were freezing. Without central heating, insulated windows, or even a comfortable mattress by modern standards, your biggest enemy wasn't rival knights. It was the cold. Survival depended on a few clever tricks. Before we continue, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy my content. And if you're listening now, leave your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where people are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, slow your breathing, and picture preparing for bed in a medieval stronghold. You trudge across the flagstone floor of a great chamber, boots scraping against surfaces worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The cold bites at your skin, even fully dressed. Stone walls don't just resist warmth, they absorb it completely. Historians often call castles marvels of defense, but rarely marvels of comfort. Here's the blunt truth. Those thick walls that could shrug off a battering ram also trapped cold air like a giant refrigerator. Once the sun set, indoor temperatures fell nearly as fast as the outside. Your breath forms clouds in front of your face. The air feels heavy, damp, and unwelcoming. Castles were built to keep enemies out, not to fend off the chill. Architects planned moats, drawbridges, and arrow slits, but insulation wasn't part of the blueprint. An important fact to remember: many northern European castles were placed on windswept hills. Militarily, that was genius. You could see invaders coming, and slopes gave a defensive advantage. But for anyone trying to sleep, it was a nightmare. Wind scoured every surface, forcing icy drafts through shutter gaps and under doors. Sleep came hard in these conditions. You might assume fireplaces would solve the problem. Not really. Even a roaring fire in the great hall barely warmed the space immediately around it. Move a few steps away, and it felt like a cellar instead of a living area. Here's a curious detail. Late medieval travelers recorded frost forming inside castle bedrooms. Imagine waking to icicles hanging from bed curtains or a frozen wash basin. Chroniclers treated this as almost normal. If your chamber didn't develop a thin layer of frost in January, you were in the minority. Despite the harsh conditions, people survived. They found ways to keep their bodies from freezing. Survival often followed ritual. As night fell, households followed routines designed to conserve heat. The castle might have been enormous, but the nighttime goal was to shrink the living space. Fires were banked, beds arranged with curtains, clothes layered until mobility became secondary, and everyone hoped the drafts weren't too cruel. Picture yourself entering a medieval bedchamber. The bed is an impressive carpentry piece, raised high above the floor. Not for style, but to escape the coldest layer of air, which always sinks. Even so, the stone radiates chill upward, and you feel it the moment you climb under the covers. Historians still debate whether castles truly became warmer at night, but the struggle against cold was constant. 2 centuries later, historians still debate whether medieval inhabitants were genuinely comfortable or if tales of cozy noble life were simply exaggerated by later storytellers. Some argue that tapestries and heavy draperies did make rooms warmer, while others insist that the cold always dominated, no matter how much fabric hung on the walls. The reality likely sits somewhere in between. Life improved slightly, but true comfort remained elusive. Picture yourself lying in this imagined bed. The wooden frame creaks as the straw-stuffed mattress shifts beneath you. Outside, the wind moans against the battlements. A small oil lamp flickers feebly at your bedside, struggling to stay lit. Your toes ache from the sharp cold, even though you're still in your daytime clothes. Then come the sounds of the castle at night. The distant echo of boots as a guard changes watch, rafters groaning under frost, a dog barking faintly in the courtyard, and the occasional drip of water freezing nearby. None of these sounds offer comfort. They only remind you that the world beyond the walls is unforgiving. It's easy to imagine nobles snuggled in warmth while peasants shivered in their cottages. Yet sometimes the opposite was true. Peasants' homes, built from wood or wattle and daub, often trapped the heat of a hearth more efficiently than the vast, stone chambers of a lord's castle. A single fire in a small hut could keep an entire family reasonably warm, while a noble might shiver in a stone room so large that even 5 roaring fireplaces would barely help. Contemporary letters from clerics and visiting nobles remark on the difficulty of sleeping in castles during winter. Beds were grand, but nights were bitter. Travelers were often advised to carry extra cloaks, not for fashion, but for survival. As you imagine lying there, you start to appreciate the ingenuity needed just to endure the night. Medieval sleepers didn't simply crawl under blankets and hope for warmth. They layered fabrics, piled furs, drew curtains tight, and sometimes shared beds with companions, human or animal. Each measure was designed to create a small microclimate, a personal zone of warmth in a relentlessly cold environment. This perspective reshapes how we view medieval life. These people were not just lords, warriors, monks, or maidens, they were survivalists. Every night was a challenge, every winter a trial, and sleep, which we now take for granted, had to be carefully engineered through rituals passed down over generations. Imagine the small joys. A dog pressed against your feet, hot stones near your bedding, or managing to keep frost off your beard. These tiny victories left a stronger impression than any feast or hunt. Survival itself became memorable. Tonight, as you lie in your modern bed with central heating humming softly, spare a thought for those who once shivered in stone chambers. Their nights were long, mornings bitter, yet they endured. They found ways to sleep in spaces that should have been uninhabitable. That ingenuity is what we'll continue to explore, layer by layer, trick by trick, as we journey deeper into the medieval night. Now, imagine stepping into the Great Hall, the beating heart of any medieval castle. If the bedchamber was a tomb of stone and draughts, this room is alive with warmth. Long trestle tables stretch across the floor, polished by countless elbows and tankards. The air carries the smells of roasted meat, spilled ale, damp wool, and lingering smoke. The central hearth blazes, a defiant square of orange heat against the creeping winter darkness. This is where the castle truly came alive after sunset. People gathered here not only to eat but also to absorb as much warmth as possible before retreating to their icy chambers. Servants dart back and forth carrying trenchers of bread, jugs of ale, and great platters of steaming pottage. Dogs scavenge underfoot, tails wagging, hoping for scraps. The hall is loud, almost raucous with laughter, song, and the clattering of knives against plates. For a little while, you forget that outside the wind howls across the battlements, and frost is forming on the windows. Here's the plain fact. The Great Hall was the only space in most castles where heating was even remotely successful. A huge open hearth dominated the center or end of the room, and the fire was fed almost constantly in winter. Logs, sometimes entire tree trunks, were hauled in to keep it going. If you had rank, you claimed a seat near it, basking in that golden glow, while servants or less fortunate souls shivered along the edges. But here's the catch. Even in this grand room, the heat only traveled so far. The farther you sat from the flames, the colder the air became, until it felt as though the walls themselves breathed out frost. Heat rose upward, trapped in the smoke-stained rafters, while those on the floor wrapped themselves in cloaks and huddled together. In truth, only a lucky few were ever warm, and everyone else pretended to be. One quirky tidbit that chroniclers mention is that feasts sometimes doubled as strategic heating sessions. Nobles scheduled their largest gatherings during the bitter months, knowing that the body heat of hundreds of guests, combined with the fire, would turn the Great Hall into something approaching cozy. In some accounts, it's even said that servants were told to stand closer together simply to generate extra warmth. You could say that feasting was as much about survival as it was about merrymaking. But the glow of the hall didn't last. When the feast wound down, the minstrels packed away their instruments, and the guests staggered off to their beds. The fire was eventually allowed to burn low. Embers glowed red, a last stand against the cold, and shadows grew long on the stone walls. That heat you clung to during the evening dissipated quickly. Within an hour or two, The great hall itself would fall back into frigid silence. Imagine yourself now. You're lingering by the fire, unwilling to leave, stretching your hands to soak up every last spark of warmth. Your cheeks glow hot, but the back of your body already feels the cold creeping in, reminding you of what waits upstairs. The smoke stings your eyes and clings to your hair, but you still dread the moment when you have to climb the spiral staircase to your chamber. Historians still debate whether some castles developed more sophisticated heating systems for their great halls. A few argue that vents and flue allowed the warmth to circulate, especially in later centuries. Others suggest this is wishful thinking, pointing out that medieval building technology simply didn't prioritize comfort. The consensus leans toward the harsher truth. The Great Hall was warm only in the immediate vicinity of the fire and nowhere else. Even the acoustics reminded you that this wasn't a cozy lodge but a cavernous chamber of power. Every laugh echoed, every footstep amplified until the soundscape itself seemed too large, too cold. And when the hall emptied, the silence became oppressive, like sitting in the belly of a sleeping giant. One of the most telling images is the transition itself. The walk from the great hall to your bedchamber. Picture leaving the golden fire light, stepping into a narrow passage lit by a single torch. The draft hits you instantly, a knife of cold air rushing through arrow slits and unsealed doorways. Your breath fogs again. The warmth you just carried in your bones drains away as though the castle itself is feeding on it. That shift from one room of temporary comfort to the endless chill beyond defined medieval nights. Sometimes nobles lingered so long in the great hall that they practically slept there. A high-backed bench pulled close to the hearth could serve as a makeshift bed, and servants or guards often collapsed near the embers rather than. For travelers faced their chambers reluctantly. Sleeping near the fire carried risks, sparks, smoke, and constant noise. But against the icy stone walls above, it was still inviting. Records note an interesting detail. Visitors often complained more about the short journey from the Great Hall to the sleeping quarters than about the sleep itself. That brief exposure to the cold was described as a shock to the body. People reported shivers that lasted all night from that walk. It was as if the castle punished anyone who dared to imagine comfort. The fading glow of the Great Hall affected the mind as much as the body. Leaving it meant surrendering to a long, merciless night. The Great Hall was more than just a room. It was a ritual, a gathering of warmth before the cold reclaimed its domain. Every extinguished torch, every emptied cup, marked another step toward a shivering night in bed. Even in the soft candlelight, the temporary nature of comfort was clear. The once roaring fire now whispered faintly, sparks dying out. A servant poked at it half-heartedly, then gave up, leaving the embers to fade. The sounds of laughter and feasting vanished, replaced by the quiet creaks and groans of a castle settling for the night. Reluctantly, you climb the staircase, cloak wrapped tightly, the memory of warmth fading with each step. The glow of the great hall lingers in your mind like a fleeting dream, but already your toes are numb, your fingers sting, and you realize the rest of the night will be a struggle against cold. That brief warmth kept people sane. The ritual of gathering, feasting, and sitting by the fire before the cold returned was vital. Without the great hall, castle life would have been unbearable. With it, people at least remembered what warmth felt like, even for a few hours. Ascending into the keep, the air changes immediately. The fire's warmth disappears, replaced by a damp cold that seeps into your bones. The walls are enormous, thicker than any modern home. Truly insulate, or were they merely decorative? Some argue the hangings cut drafts noticeably, creating pockets of warmth, while others claim the effect is exaggerated in later romanticized accounts. Even the richest cloth could not compete with freezing air seeping through unglazed windows. The debate remains unresolved, but one point is clear. People were willing to try almost anything to cope with the cold. Picture this: you enter a bedchamber in late January. The fire in the hearth is small, perhaps already dying. The walls rise like cliffs, slick with condensation despite layers of wool. You shiver. The bed dominates the room, heavy curtains drawn around it. Inside that small cocoon, the air might feel slightly warmer, But beyond it, the chamber resembles a stone tomb. The psychological impact was just as harsh as the physical chill. People often wrote about fearing the cold more than hunger or illness. At least hunger and disease eventually passed. The cold, however, returned relentlessly every night. Living in a castle offered no escape. That sense of being trapped in your own home left a lasting mark. You imagine lying in bed, drawing the cover tight, listening to wind whisper through arrow slits. Your ears burn, your fingers stiffen. Even your dreams are haunted by images of ice and fire. The stone walls, intended as protection, feel more like a refrigerator that never turns off. Here's the shift in perspective. Castles were not glamorous daily retreats. They were survival machines, but comfort was sacrificed for security. Each winter night reminded you that while stone walls could stop arrows, they could not stop the cold. Sleeping in a medieval castle was less about peaceful rest and more about waging a quiet war against the environment. The enemy was invisible but unrelenting, and the battlefield was always the same. Your chamber, your bed, your body. You walk across the chamber floor. Instead of carpets or polished wood, your boots crunch against rushes scattered over the stone. These rushes were practical, softening the cold, absorbing spills, and acting as crude insulation. Records from the later Middle Ages show that households refreshed these rushes several times a year, layering them thick in noble halls and chambers. When freshly laid, they carried a faint, pleasant scent of the outdoors, grassy, earthy, almost summery. For a moment, it might feel as if part of summer had been brought inside. The rushes added padding, muffled footsteps, and helped trap the little warmth available near the ground. But that comfort was temporary. Over time, the rushes grew foul. Food scraps, spilled ale, and stray bones became embedded. Mice and insects treated the floor as their playground. The idea of a cozy, natural carpet is misleading. By winter's end, the rushes could be so dirty that one French moralist compared sleeping on them to lying in a midden. What's striking is how these rushes served a dual purpose. They trapped a thin layer of warmth but also absorbed moisture from the constantly damp stone walls. Without them, every step would be across slick stone and freezing puddles. Some English household accounts note that herbs like lavender, rosemary, or meadow were sometimes sprinkled among the rushes. This served a practical purpose, masking the odor of rotting scraps, but also offered a small comfort. Imagine settling into bed and catching a faint hint of lavender beneath the pervasive smell of wet wool and smoke. It wouldn't make you warmer, but it might make the night slightly more tolerable. Architectural historians continue to debate the effectiveness of rushes. Some argue that they genuinely insulated against the icy stone floor, while others see their impact as minimal. 6 others dismiss them as largely symbolic gestures aimed at cleanliness and order, noting that most heat was lost through walls and ceilings. The evidence is inconsistent, leaving the question: were rushes a genuine medieval method for warmth, or simply a messy habit dressed up as tradition? Picture yourself lying in bed while a servant finishes spreading fresh rushes across the floor. They crunch softly beneath your feet, releasing faint herbal aromas. For a brief moment, the room seems cleaner, almost orderly. Yet by morning, the rushes will have absorbed moisture, beginning the inevitable cycle of decay. Consider the sensory environment of such a bedroom. Beneath your sheets, wool or fur offers comfort. Above you, the musty scent of old rushes mixes with the sharp tang of herbs and the lingering smoke clinging to clothing. The floor rustles as mice scurry for scraps. Every detail reinforces that survival, not luxury, dictated the experience of sleep. Yet there's a certain ingenuity here. Medieval people used the simplest materials, gathered from riversides and fields, transforming them into practical tools to endure winter. Carpets or insulation were not part of their vocabulary. Instead, they relied on whatever could keep the cold slightly at bay. In this imagined chamber, even the floor is part of the nightly struggle against chill. Stone is the enemy, rushes a fragile shield, and every morning begins with the question: how long before dampness and decay betray you? Sitting on the edge of the bed, your fingers brush layers of fabric piled high. If medieval people had a secret weapon against nighttime cold, it was textiles. Wool, linen, and fur were layered until the sleeper resembled a cocoon more than a person. Household records emphasize how central textiles were to medieval life. Linen sheets were standard, smooth and cool but not insulating. Above them came thick woolen blankets, heavy enough that some likened them to the weight of a dog. Wealthier households added fur collets, fox, sable, even bear, investing heavily in bedding for both comfort and survival, as winter nights could be deadly. Sources reveal a humorous side. Servants noted that masters sometimes couldn't move once wrapped in all their layers. 5 or 6 heavy blankets could pin someone down, forcing stillness or risking exposure if the covers were disturbed. Warmth came at the cost of mobility, a compromise most accepted. Fur deserves special attention. Beyond luxury, it was highly practical. Arctic fox pelts, marten skins, and sheepskin provided dense insulation. One chronicler recounts a noblewoman in Burgundy who refused to travel without her erine-lined bed covers, even in summer, fearing chills at night. To modern readers it seems extreme, but in drafty medieval rooms, concern for cold was rational. Some households practiced unusual bedding strategies. They believed too much linen could be unhealthy, supposedly drawing heat from the body. To compensate, they layered wool or fur above and below, creating a textile sandwich. Linen cooled, wool warmed, and fur trapped heat. Whether the theory worked scientifically is doubtful, but it illustrates the mix of folklore and practical comfort. Scholars still debate the social role of these textiles. Was fur purely functional or mostly a status symbol? Inventories show wealthy nobles owned vast numbers of fur collets, yet poorer families survived without them. 7 relying on coarse wool instead of furs was common, yet historians debate the true purpose of animal pelts. Some suggest they were symbols of status and power, while others insist they were essential for survival in drafty castles. The reality likely fell somewhere in between. Furs were both protective tools and markers of prestige. Picture yourself wrapped in these layers. The wool scratches lightly against your skin, rougher than anything we use today. Over it, the dense fur presses in, almost suffocating, yet effectively keeping the cold out. Heavy blankets weigh down on the straw mattress beneath you. Any significant movement risks letting icy air into your cocoon. Your breath warms the air near your face, while the rest of your body depends entirely on the layers surrounding it. The silence magnifies every sensation. The rustle of linen, the scratch of coarse wool, the faint scent of animal pelts. There's a primal intimacy to it. Each thread and hair reminds you that survival depends on turning your environment into protection. This is the essence of medieval sleep, building a fortress within a fortress, not with stone and battlements, but with cloth and fur. Each night, people barricaded themselves against the cold using every available textile. Without these layers, even the grandest chamber would feel like a tomb. In this imagined cocoon, the nightly ritual becomes clear. Layer yourself, weigh down the bedding, and hope it lasts until morning. Cold may whistle through shutters, creep along the stone walls, and swirl around your bed. But inside your fabric fortress, you had a fighting chance. The bed itself was more than furniture. It functioned as a small, livable climate in an otherwise hostile room. Pulling back the heavy curtains of a medieval bed reveals more than a private sleeping space. It exposes a carefully designed micro-world built for survival. Inventories from noble households underline the bed's importance. Unlike the simple pallets of peasants, these frames were tall, sometimes as high as a person, carved from oak or walnut. Posts stood like pillars, often ornate, supporting a canopy that was both decorative and practical. Draping curtains around it trapped body heat, turning an icy chamber into a tolerable sleeping space, like a tent within your bedroom. When the curtains closed, the difference was noticeable. Heat from breath and body, combined with thick bedding, created warmth in rooms that could hover near freezing. Even a few extra degrees could mean the difference between misery and a tolerable night. Records tell of a French duchess who traveled with her bed dismantled and carted along. Proof that the bed was essential, more than mere furniture. Sleeping without one in a new castle or abbey could mean shivering through the night. English sources provide another detail. Curtains were sometimes waxed or lined with oiled cloth to block drafts. Pulling them closed, you would feel the heavy fabric, scented faintly with beeswax or resin. These curtains did more than keep out cold. They darkened the room, muffled sound, and created a sense of privacy in spaces that were rarely private. Modern scholars still debate the bed's effectiveness. Did they genuinely warm their occupants, or have romanticized depictions exaggerated their value? Archaeological evidence suggests the curtains were thick and layered, supporting their practical use. Some argue the warmth may have been as psychological as physical, offering a sense of enclosure, shelter, and safety from the cold. While the debate continues, one fact remains certain. People believed in the power of these beds. 8. Their importance was so high that portable beds became a practical necessity for the nobility. Now imagine sliding into one yourself. The bed creaks under your weight. The straw mattress rustles. You reach to pull the curtain closed. Immediately, the air feels different. Still cold, yes, but no longer pierced by drafts from the arrow slits. Your breath fogs less quickly. You sink into the layered covers, and you feel that sleep might finally come. The curtain muffles distant sounds. The drip of water from the walls, a servant's cough in the hallway, even a dog barking outside. Inside, the air smells of fabric and fur, faintly musky, yet oddly comforting. The only sound is the shift of blankets as you move. The chamber beyond may be harsh and unwelcoming, but here, within your bed, you've carved out a small pocket of safety against the elements. It wasn't perfect. Some nights, condensation froze the curtains stiff. Other nights, smoke from the hearth drifted inside, waking you with a cough. But for most nobles, the four-poster canopy bed represented the best protection against the nightly assault of cold. Here, the ingenuity of medieval people becomes clear, not in grand inventions, but in small, clever adaptations. No central heating? Create a private climate bubble. No insulation? Hang thick curtains and seal yourself in. Every night was a negotiation with the cold, and the canopy bed was the closest thing to a truce. Picture yourself lying there, eyelids heavy, the world beyond the curtain fading into silence. The chamber remains cold, the castle still drafty, but you've created a space where survival feels possible. You drift toward sleep, not because the night has grown warmer, but because you've managed, with fabric and wood, to outwit it just enough. Beneath all the blankets and curtains, the foundation of your rest was the mattress itself. What lay beneath you determined whether the night was tolerable or whether you awoke aching, frozen, and irritable. In the Middle Ages, bedding came in many forms, but two stood out: the feather bed and the straw tick. The feather bed was the luxury choice. Picture sinking into a sack stuffed with goose or duck feathers, soft and pliable, cradling your body in warmth. Inventories from noble estates often list multiple feather beds, carefully stored and moved with the household whenever the lord traveled. A well-stuffed feather mattress could raise one nearly a foot above the bed frame, providing a bouncy cushion in an otherwise unforgiving chamber. Families treasured them, guarded them, and passed them down through generations. They weren't just comfortable, they were symbols of status. But feather beds had their downsides. They could trap body heat, leaving sleepers drenched in sweat even during winter. One 15th-century letter humorously recounts a guest complaining that his host's bed swallowed him like a goose in a pot. Too many feathers meant sinking too deep, turning what should have been a gentle sleep into a struggle to climb back to the surface. For most people, however, the reality was a straw tick, a large sack filled with straw, hay, or reeds, forming a basic mattress. Peasants used them, soldiers used them, and even castles equipped lesser chambers with them. Straw ticks were inexpensive, easy to refill, and provided some lift off the cold floor. But straw came with its own problems. It flattened quickly, poked through the cloth, and often harbored fleas. Households had to beat the sack regularly, literally shaking it to fluff the straw and drive out vermin. By morning, your body might be scratched or itchy, but at least you had survived the night. Contemporary accounts note a curious detail. Some people mixed herbs into the straw. Lavender, mint, or pennyroyal might be added to mask the sour smell of damp hay and repel pests. If you've ever slept on a straw mattress, you know its scent never quite disappears. 9. Lingering, earthy, and slightly musty. The smell seeped into clothes and hair. Scholars still debate how common feather beds actually were. Some argue they were rare luxuries, reserved only for society's elite. Others point to records showing that middle-class households often owned at least one feather bed, suggesting they were more widespread than previously thought. The disagreement stems from incomplete evidence, but it highlights one clear point. Sleeping arrangements mattered enough to be carefully recorded. Picture lying on a straw tick in a cold, drafty room. The sack rustles beneath you, uneven lumps pressing into your back. Each movement releases a faint grassy scent mixed with the sharp aroma of dried herbs. Somewhere in the rushes on the floor, mice scurry quietly, and you wonder if they might come closer. Heavy blankets cover you, but the straw underneath reminds you that comfort was never guaranteed. Now imagine a feather bed in a noble chamber. You sink into soft down, your body cradled by the fluff. It feels luxurious at first, but soon warmth builds, and the feathers shift, forming hollows that hold you too tightly. You push at the blankets, searching for air, yet the curtains trap the heat. Still, you fall asleep, knowing that this discomfort is far superior to the hardships of straw. The choice between straw and feathers reflected the medieval social hierarchy. Sleeping on feathers signaled privilege. Sleeping on straw signaled necessity. Both, however, were responses to the same challenge: keeping the body alive in cold, unwelcoming stone chambers. As you imagine settling into bed tonight, it becomes clear that medieval sleepers were never passive. Every mattress, humble or grand, represented care, adaptation, and a small triumph over the cold. Sleep was not mere collapse. It was a calculated choice. Sink into feathers or endure straw, all in the hope of lasting until dawn. Even the most elaborate bed, with curtains, down mattresses, and layered blankets, couldn't guarantee warmth alone. What made the difference on the coldest nights was companionship. Sleeping alone in a stone chamber meant body heat bled into the walls. Sharing space with others multiplied warmth. Bodies pressed together in the dark acted like radiators. Noble households recognized this, though seldom spoke of it openly. Servants often slept nearby or even at the foot of their master's bed. The arrangement wasn't only for service or security. It was practical. More bodies meant slightly higher temperatures, a few precious degrees that could matter immensely by midnight, when frost formed on shutters. Records from medieval monasteries show monks sleeping in long rows, cots or straw beds lined side by side in drafty dormitories. The arrangement served both discipline and survival. In crowded quarters, shared body heat formed a thin layer of insulation. The same principle applied to military barracks, where soldiers huddled closely, cloaks drawn tight, trusting that together they would resist the chill better than alone. One notable story comes from a 14th-century English manor. A nobleman's will specifically instructed that his favored squire sleep near the chamber fire. Scholars interpret this as both a mark of personal favor and recognition that warmth from companionship could be as valuable as inheritance. To be invited into a bed or chamber was not merely intimacy, it was a privilege of survival. Animals played a role as well. Dogs, in particular, served as literal heaters. While the phrase "a three-dog night" originates later folklore, the idea reflects reality. Medieval people often allowed hounds into beds for warmth as much as companionship. A couple of large mastiffs curled at one's feet could make a significant difference on the coldest nights. 10. The difference between numb toes and true comfort was a crucial concern for medieval sleepers. Travelers recorded that in some inns, guests often slept shoulder to shoulder with dogs, goats, or even sheep. The smell could be overwhelming, but warmth always took priority over fragrance. Historians still debate how socially acceptable such bed sharing was among the elite. Some argue it was common for lords to share with trusted companions, ladies with maids, and travelers with strangers. Others maintain that intimacy among nobles was limited, with servants typically placed on nearby pallets rather than inside the bed itself. What is clear is that for the lower classes, bed sharing was entirely normal. Families huddled together, parents, children, and often grandparents, creating a tangled mass of limbs beneath a single heap of blankets. Privacy was a luxury. Survival took precedence. Picture lying in such a bed, pressed shoulder to shoulder with others. The first few minutes are awkward. Elbows jab, someone coughs, a blanket slips, yet gradually warmth spreads. Body heat forms a shared cocoon. You feel the dog's weight on your feet, hear your companion's soft breathing, and your muscles slowly relax. Outside, the castle may howl with wind, but inside this cluster, comfort seems possible. There were drawbacks, of course. Fleas and lice were common, and whispered conversations carried secrets. Yet when weighed against the alternative, shivering through a sleepless night, the choice was obvious. Warmth over dignity, companionship over solitude. To modern minds, sharing a bed with servants, siblings, or animals might feel uncomfortable, but for medieval sleepers it was a practical survival strategy. In a world of stone and frost, every extra body was a blessing. Tonight, as you pull your blanket tighter, remember those long-ago sleepers who faced the cold with fewer defenses. Their solution was simple: share warmth and hope the night proved merciful. But it wasn't just blankets that provided protection. Clothing was a critical part of staying warm. Unlike modern customs of pajamas or nothing at all, medieval people often went to bed nearly as bundled as they were during the day. Surviving garments and household records show that the staple bedtime attire was the night shirt, a long, loose linen garment resembling an oversized tunic. Linen may not seem warm today, but it was practical. Easy to wash, smooth against the skin, and breathable. Over that, sleepers might add a wool tunic or even a cloak, depending on how cold it was. The guiding principle was simple: more layers meant more warmth. A distinctive feature of medieval sleepwear was the nightcap, or qua. These small cloth caps were tied under the chin or pulled snugly over the head. Why the emphasis on covering the skull? Because it was widely believed that most body heat escaped through the head. A sleeper without a qua was dangerously exposed, like a knight without armor. Illuminated manuscripts show figures tucked into bed with their heads wrapped, appearing more ready for travel than for rest. Night shirts varied in length and quality. Poor families made do with what they had, often repurposing their undertunics for sleep. Wealthier nobles could afford embroidered nightwear edged in fur. Some women even had sleeping hoods with trailing ribbons, though these were likely impractical. Regardless of style, the principle remained: cover everything you could. A 15th century medical text even recommends binding feet in linen or wool before bed. This was not decorative, it was an early recognition that extremities froze first. Medieval sleepers wrapped their toes, ankles, and sometimes hands in strips of cloth, creating makeshift socks and mittens to keep the cold at bay. 11. You can almost sense it. Your hands wrapped, your feet enclosed, every bit of skin protected from the harsh cold. But what about the debate itself? Scholars still disagree on how common dedicated sleepwear truly was compared to simply reusing daytime clothing. Some maintain that peasants had no separate night garments and simply slept in whatever they wore during the day. Others highlight wills and inventories that reference specific night linens, suggesting that at least among the middle and upper classes, distinct sleep clothing was typical. Both positions carry weight, varying by status and region. Still, everyone agrees that covering up at night was essential. Now imagine getting ready for bed in that manner. You remove your heavier outer layers, put on a long linen shirt, and pull a cap tightly over your ears. The air brushes cold against your neck until you draw the blankets closer. Every layer of fabric offers a small degree of protection, and together they create a cocoon. The bed may be drafty, the room bitterly cold, but your body becomes a small fortress of cloth. The sensory details are striking. The linen feels cool and slightly rough at first, softening as your skin warms it. The wool carries a mild scent of sheep and lanolin, earthy yet comforting. Your cap rests firmly around your head, softening sound and giving a sense of enclosure. You settle into place, bundled like a parcel, and wait for sleep to take over. There was also another purpose behind night clothing besides warmth: modesty. In a world where sharing beds was normal, being half-dressed or unclothed was improper. Even married couples are often shown in manuscripts wearing caps and long shirts while in bed. It wasn't only about comfort, it was about maintaining decorum. So regardless of whether you were a lord, lady, servant, or soldier, your nightshirt and coif served a social role as much as a practical one. Think about the rhythm of such nights. The routine of preparing not by removing layers but by adding them. Tying knots, adjusting cloth, and smoothing fabric before the lights went out. Today we link nightwear with ease and relaxation. For the medieval sleeper, it acted more like protection against the cold. So as you pull up your own blanket tonight, consider those people long ago who went to bed looking more like travelers than dreamers. Wrapped in linen and wool, their heads covered against the darkness. Their rest was not effortless. It was crafted carefully, layer by layer, against the persistent chill of stone walls. Picture the moment just before lying down. A servant approaches carrying a long-handled pan, its brass surface glowing faintly in the firelight. Inside, hot coals crackle softly, filling the room with the scent of ash and heated metal. This was the medieval warming pan, a simple yet effective tool, because few wanted to settle into sheets that felt like blocks of ice. The routine worked like this. The servant moved the pan back and forth between the bedclothes, the coals inside sending warmth through small perforations. The sheets puffed slightly with smoke, and the air filled with the faint smell of burning wood. For those few minutes, the bed shifted from a frozen surface to something nearly welcoming. Without this step, you might lie shivering for an hour before your body heat eased the chill. Household inventories from noble families record warming pans alongside candlesticks and chamber pots, everyday items of nightly use. They were not rare. They were expected. By the late Middle Ages, wealthy homes across Europe considered them essential during winter. A room without one was either overlooked or assigned to someone whose status did not justify the comfort. Yet these pans came with risks. Letters from the period mention sheets scorched or even burned when a pan was left in one place too long. Imagine getting into bed and finding a smoking hole where your linen once was. Tales survive, part amusing, part unfortunate, of noblemen leaping from bed in the night after sparks from a warming pan set their blankets or even wooden roofs alight. 12 A chamber lined with dry rushes could easily catch fire, and such incidents were taken seriously. One unusual report from Italy describes scattering aromatic herbs onto hot coals before warming the bed. People believed the resulting smoke cleaned the air and protected against illness. You can almost imagine the scent now. Lavender and rosemary blending with the sharp smell of embers as it settled into the bedding. This practice mixed practical reasoning with old beliefs, forming a nightly effort to fight both the cold and the threat of unseen disease. Experts in medieval household life still debate how common warming pans actually were. Some claim they appeared mainly in wealthy homes because they were costly and carried fire risks. Others argue that simpler versions, like clay pots filled with embers and wrapped in cloth, were often used by middle-ranking families. The real picture is unclear since these basic items rarely survived over time. What is certain, though, is that some form of preheating the bed existed throughout society, even if the tools differed. Now picture the process in your own chamber. A servant slowly moves the pan across the sheets, thin steam rising as moisture disappears. Once the pan is removed, the air under the covers feels surprisingly warm, almost shocking after the room's harsh chill. You slide in quickly, trying to keep the heat from escaping. A chamber that felt like a frozen cave became far more tolerable with a few dogs tucked at your feet. Household documents from the later Middle Ages even mention small lapdogs gifted to noblewomen, valued not just for companionship but for warmth. These early comfort dogs were well cared for, groomed, and even perfumed, yet their main purpose was to keep their owners warm during freezing nights. Larger dogs lay across the bottom of the bed like furry barriers, guarding toes from the cold. There is also an interesting account from Scandinavia describing how winter travelers sometimes preferred sleeping in animal stalls over unheated guest rooms. The warmth produced by horses, cattle, and sheep made these spaces far more comfortable than a cold, empty bed in stone lodgings. Imagine drifting off beside a quietly breathing cow, the air thick with the scent of hay, but your body warmed by the steady heat of its presence. Not elegant, perhaps, but undeniably effective. 13 dogs, however, carried a unique kind of closeness. A medieval French proverb says that a loyal dog keeps the frost from its master's heart. The line is both literal and poetic. The animal's warmth protected the body, while its presence calmed the spirit in lonely, drafty castles. Scholars still disagree on how common this habit truly was. Some argue that letting dogs into noble beds was discouraged in formal households, kept as a quiet personal choice rather than an accepted custom. Others claim the evidence shows it was widespread, especially in rural or frontier castles where survival outweighed etiquette. The debate revolves around whether the familiar image of a lady sleeping with a lapdog is a romantic invention or a practical reality. Now imagine the moment clearly. You are wrapped in a linen nightshirt and wool blankets, the bed curtains pulled tightly around you. Outside, the wind howls along the battlements. Your toes sting with cold until suddenly you feel the warmth of a hound pressed against them. Its fur is rough, its body solid, and although it carries the scent of the hunt and the open air, you accept its heat without hesitation. Another dog curls beside you, and soon you are enclosed not only in cloth but in living warmth. The chamber may still be icy, but inside the bed the world feels transformed. Of course, this comfort came with inconveniences. Dogs shed hair, tracked in dirt, and sometimes chewed on bones hidden beneath the blankets. Insects traveled with them and spread easily to the humans they slept beside. Even so, most considered the trade-off worth it. Fleas were better than frostbite. A dusty blanket was better than a sleepless night. The sensory mix was unforgettable. The earthy smell of dog fur, the faint smoke clinging to your clothes, the heavy weight of layered blankets, and beneath it all the steady rhythm of another creature breathing. It is no surprise that people spoke of their animals with affection that bordered on reverence. Sharing warmth meant sharing survival. The idea behind the phrase, a three-dog night, though coined much later, reflects the reality of medieval sleeping habits. 1 dog meant the cold was tolerable, 2 meant it was serious, and 3 meant the night was so bitter that even nobles gathered every source of heat they could find into their beds. So as you lie in your own bed tonight, consider how extraordinary it must have felt for people in stone castles, surrounded by drafts and darkness, to find strength and comfort in the simple loyalty of an animal curled beside them. In that small exchange of warmth, humans and dogs helped keep each other alive through countless winter nights. Now pull the curtains back for a moment and step outside the noble chamber in your imagination. Across the courtyard, in the shadowed servants' quarters, another world of sleep appears. The contrast between peasant and noble rest was striking, yet both sought the same thing: survival through bitter cold. Who, then, truly slept warmer? The answer is not as obvious as it seems. Nobles had luxury: feather beds, fur coverlets, warming pans, and thick canopies. But luxury did not always equal comfort. Their bedchambers were huge, built as much for display as for rest, and their size made them hard to heat. Even with large fireplaces, the stone walls absorbed warmth quickly. A lord might lie on piles of down and fur, yet still breathe air that turned to mist in front of him. Peasants, meanwhile, lived in smaller houses made of timber and daub, compact enough that a single hearth warmed the entire room. A thatched roof packed with straw acted as natural insulation. Families slept close together, often with animals sheltered at one end of the space, and their combined heat kept the air far more comfortable than that of a drafty castle. A visitor to a 14th-century English village wrote with mild surprise that although the huts were simple, they held warmth better than the Lord's Tower. Even so, status influenced more than warmth alone. Nobles had access to better materials: fine wool, imported furs, and linen softened through repeated washing. Peasants relied on coarse wool, blankets patched until they thinned, or sheepskins roughly cured for bedding. 14 smokehouses were common, and their bedding carried the strong scent of lanolin and hearth smoke. Kept people warm, but it rarely looked or felt luxurious. Memorial records even mention that peasants sometimes slept directly on benches near the fire, their children tucked into their laps. They risked sparks and smoke, but staying close to the hearth meant reliable warmth. By contrast, the noble's bedchamber, usually separated from the Great Hall, often lacked that immediate heat. Comfort, therefore, was unevenly distributed and not always in the way one might expect. Researchers today still debate the actual hierarchy of warmth. Did wealth automatically provide better sleep, or did peasants, in their tight but well-insulated cottages, manage winter nights more easily? Evidence supports both views. Some scholars argue that nobles benefited from vast amounts of textiles. Others say the small communal rooms of the lower classes created practical warmth that grand aristocratic spaces could not replicate. The discussion remains unresolved, showing how sleep itself reflected social divisions. Picture the two scenes side by side. In the castle, a nobleman shifts beneath layers of fabric, his breath misting in the cold air as wind rattles the shutters of the enormous room. In the village below, a peasant family gathers on a straw mattress near the hearth, children curled together like kittens, the scent of animals drifting in from the stall next door. One bed is ornate and formal, the other is crowded and earthy. But which sleeper wakes warmer? The question lingers, and perhaps no single answer applies in every case. Still, both nobles and peasants shared a common truth. They adapted. Survival during a medieval night was less about perfect comfort and more about learning to endure hardship, reshaping daily habits until rest became possible. Nobles displayed luxury. Peasants relied on closeness and simplicity. Yet all slept beneath the same winter sky, shivering and waiting for morning. As you settle into your own warm bed tonight, the irony becomes clear. Status shaped the surroundings, but not always the quality of sleep. Sometimes the humblest cottage held more real warmth than the grandest hall. You might assume that once a noble's bed was placed in a chamber, it stayed there permanently. These beds were heavy structures, complete with carved posts and curtains. But in practice, families often changed sleeping locations depending on the season. Bedrooms were not fixed sanctuaries. They were flexible spaces chosen according to sunlight, fire, and wind. People sought out the sun in winter and avoided it in summer. Estate documents make this pattern obvious. Many castles had winter and summer chambers, not for variety, but because warmth demanded it. In the cold months, families moved into rooms with southern exposure, where even a few hours of weak sunlight helped warm the walls and soften the morning chill. In summer, those same rooms were abandoned for north-facing spaces that stayed darker and cooler. A well-recorded example appears in the accounts of Edward Ivy's household, where entire beds and furnishings were moved seasonally. Servants carried feather mattresses, linens, and tapestries from one room to the next, building temporary sleeping spaces wherever the king preferred. It was a logistical burden, but for anyone living in stone walls, mobility was essential. One curious note survives from a Burgundian courtier who wrote that he lost his chamber to the frost one year. The walls became so damp and cold that he refused to sleep there, choosing instead a smaller room facing the sunrise. His wording reminds us that in castles, the building itself could feel like an opponent. Rooms were claimed by the cold, abandoned, and reclaimed as the seasons shifted. Archaeologists and architectural historians continue to. 15 Debate continues over whether every castle truly offered multiple seasonal chambers or whether this was a privilege reserved for the largest and wealthiest estates. Some claim most fortresses had only a few practical sleeping rooms, leaving residents to endure the cold wherever they were. Others argue that window placement, fireplaces, and surviving records indicate deliberate planning for seasonal living. The disagreement remains unresolved, yet the idea is compelling. A noble family shifting within its own walls like birds relocating their nests as the weather changed. Now picture yourself following this routine. In autumn, you start watching the sunlit side of the keep, aware that the coming long nights will require every small advantage. Servants take apart your bed, carrying the frame, mattress, and hangings piece by piece. The noise of carpenters fitting posts echoes through the new chamber, while tapestries are secured to help block drafts. By the time the first frost arrives, you are settled in a room that at least greets you with faint morning light. The sensory detail is striking. You wake to the weak warmth of sunlight slipping through shutters, the scent of freshly rehung wool curtains, and the muted sound of servants sweeping rushes across the floor of your relocated space. The move doesn't remove the cold. It simply controls it, turning what would be unbearable into something manageable. Peasants also shifted sleeping areas seasonally, though in simpler ways. Families slept nearer the hearth in winter, gathering around the fire in a single room, then moved to lofts or barns in summer where the air was cooler. In both castles and cottages, sleeping arrangements moved with the seasons, dictated by weather rather than interior design. This reminds you that medieval life lacked our modern idea of fixed bedrooms. A bedroom wasn't a permanent, private sanctuary. It was a temporary camp inside a larger stone structure. Beds shifted, chambers rotated, and life adjusted with the rhythm of the year. The castle itself felt alive, reshaped by light and temperature, its residents moving within it like nomads. And so another truth of medieval sleep becomes clear. It was dynamic, not static. The struggle against cold required movement, preparation, and continual adaptation. You didn't sleep where you preferred. You slept where the sun, wind, and damp allowed. And every year, as the earth turned, the cycle began again. Stand for a moment beside the narrow window of a medieval chamber and feel the draft slip across your skin. Unlike modern homes with glass panes and sealed frames, castle windows were simple openings in stone. They blocked arrows but welcomed the wind. Without glass, without double glazing, without even the concept of insulation, these gaps relied on shutters or stretched cloth that kept out little more than rain and birds. Household surveys show that in many castles, glass was so rare it was reserved for chapels or the lord's private oratory. Ordinary chambers had wooden shutters, heavy planks that could be barred from within. In summer they stayed open for air and light, but in winter they closed tight, groaning in the wind. Yet wood alone offered little protection. Cold seeped through gaps, and the room grew damp. A common solution was stretching cloth across the opening, often linen coated with oil or wax to make it slightly translucent and resistant to rain. By day this created a dim amber glow, soft and hazy like light through parchment. By night it softened the scream of the wind, but never fully muted it. The fabric fluttered, the frame shook, and sleepers adapted to the constant reminder that their fortress was never fully sealed. One notable reference comes from a 13th-century French household account describing horn windows. Thin slices of animal horn were scraped translucent and set into wooden frames. These provided a sturdier option than cloth, admitting pale light and better resisting weather, though they yellowed and warped quickly. Imagine looking out through such panes. The world, 16 blurred as if seen through fogged glass. Yet inside the chamber, the air was just slightly less harsh. Archaeologists and architectural historians debate how common horn or oiled cloth windows really were. Some claim they were rare luxuries reserved for the wealthiest castles, while most households relied solely on shutters. Others argue that by the later Middle Ages, these windows were surprisingly widespread across Northern Europe. The evidence is incomplete, but the very existence of debate highlights how determined people were to create barriers against the cold. Now imagine yourself at one of these windows. The shutter is closed, the cloth stretched across the frame, yet a sharp line of frost still forms along the sill. You lean near it, and your breath clouds the air. Outside, snow reflects the moonlight. Inside, you hear the faint rattle of wood and the moan of wind searching for a gap. No matter how carefully the bed curtains are hung, the draft finds its way to you. The sounds are haunting. Shutters banging in a distant corridor, fabric snapping softly like sails, servants muttering as they stuff rags into cracks. Some households even pressed moss or clay into gaps around the frames as makeshift insulation. It was messy, unsightly, and temporary, but when temperatures dropped below freezing, any protection was better than none. Peasants faced the same challenge. Their cottages often had no glass, only shutters to close narrow slits. Some stretched thin animal bladders to let in light. The effect was eerie. Rooms glowed dimly, with distorted shadows as if the world outside were behind a veil. At night, even these coverings froze, turning translucent sheets into brittle ice. For nobles, the situation was ironic. High towers gave status and defense, but also left them exposed to harsh winds. Guests often noted that the higher the chamber, the colder it felt. A peasant might envy a lord's wealth but not the draft whistling through a tower room. Yet there was also beauty. Picture lying in bed on a moonlit night. The shutters are slightly ajar, letting silver light spill across the floor. The cold seeps in. Shadows play on the walls. Branches silhouette against the curtain. The faint glow of snow outside transforms the harsh night into a fragile moment of peace. So tonight, when you draw your curtains, remember those ancient windows. They were less about keeping the cold out than reminding people that no matter how thick the walls, the night always found its way in. Sleep was not about conquering the cold, but learning to live with it, draft by draft, until morning arrived. You might imagine approaching the hearth of a castle chamber, expecting warmth from the fire. But the reality was far from comforting. Medieval fireplaces were enormous, with chimneys wide enough to feed entire trees. Yet despite the spectacle, they were inefficient at heating the room. Physics made it simple. The wider the chimney, the more heat escaped upward with the smoke. Flames roared, sparks danced, logs collapsed into glowing embers, but step a few paces away, and your breath still misted in the cold air. The fire created a bright circle of warmth nearby, while the rest of the chamber remained bitterly cold. Household records reveal how much wood this required. A single week in a large castle might consume entire wagon loads of timber. Forest management became critical not just for building but for fuel. One French lord complained in letters that keeping his great hall warm had exhausted the woods faster than any war. Fires consumed resources while rarely delivering the comfort one imagined. There are even amusing accounts. Guests joked that noble fireplaces were large enough to roast an ox, yet too weak to warm the room. 17 A warm hearth in a medieval room often promised more than it delivered. The exaggeration isn't unfounded. These fires offered spectacle, light, and a sense of grandeur, but they did little to combat the relentless chill of stone walls. Some households experimented with iron firebacks behind the flames to reflect heat into the room, while others lined hearths with tiles to hold warmth longer. Yet, these were only partial solutions, attempts to manage a problem too large to fully overcome. Sitting in front of a blazing fire might warm your feet, but your back remained cold, and your bed across the room could feel like the outdoors. Historians still debate how effective castle fireplaces truly were. Some claim they provided real warmth when combined with hangings and heavy furniture, creating layers that retained heat. Others argue they were largely symbolic, meant to display status and ceremony, with most energy escaping up the chimney. Likely, the truth varied from castle to castle, depending on resources, design, and climate. Picture yourself in such a room. The fire crackles, sparks leap onto the hearthstones, and smoke rises in a thin curl, leaving a faint tang in the air. Your face feels warm, tingling with heat, but your shoulders remain cold. You shuffle closer, extending your hands until your sleeves nearly singe, then reluctantly retreat to your bed across the chamber, where the temperature drops with every step. By the time you slip under the blankets, it feels almost as if you had remained outside. Peasants, in contrast, often fared better with smaller hearths. A single central fire in a modest cottage could warm the entire interior, smoky though it was. The cramped space allowed flames and bodies together to maintain tolerable warmth. Noble fireplaces, by contrast, burned through resources but left large chambers half-frozen. Once again, grandeur did not equal comfort. Still, the fire's ritual mattered. It was more than heat. It was a gathering point, a source of light, a reassurance against the darkness. People prayed, told stories, or dozed near the flames. Even if the warmth didn't reach the entire room, the glow offered a psychological sense of safety, a small beacon in the cold. A medieval night was not defined by roaring fires keeping frost at bay, but by fragile islands of heat that vanished once you left their proximity. The hearth was as much performance as it was practical, and the medieval sleeper learned to value what little comfort it offered. Yet another reality intruded: smoke. Fireplaces were neither clean nor efficient. They belched fumes, left soot, and filled rooms with haze that stung the eyes and coated surfaces. To sit by the fire was to breathe smoke nightly, accept blackened walls, and wake with lungs coated in ash. Chroniclers of the time noted this bitterly. One monk in northern England complained that soot in his cell made him cough more than he prayed. Even nobles suffered. Court records describe women lamenting ruined gowns and linens discolored by constant smoke. A freshly cleaned tapestry could turn gray within a single winter. Architecture worsened the problem. Chimneys were crude, wide shafts without modern draft control. Smoke often drifted back into rooms, swirling and clinging, and if the wind shifted, it poured inside, leaving everyone coughing. Imagine trying to sleep while smoke burned your throat and eyes watered. Some people, according to travelers' notes, smeared their walls with lime or clay, not just to brighten interiors, but to hide soot streaks. The black residue never truly disappeared, but at least the walls appeared cleaner. Cleanliness could be temporarily restored, but the smell lingered indefinitely. A mix of charred wood, damp stone, and scorched wool that clung to bedding and clothing. Historians remain divided over how bearable these smoky rooms really were. Some suggest that medieval people adapted over time, their bodies and expectations hardened to the constant haze. Others argue that contemporaries themselves acknowledged the health risks, citing repeated complaints in medical texts about stifling air and soot-blackened lungs. Perhaps both perspectives hold truth. People endured it because they had no alternative, yet they never stopped voicing their discomfort. Now imagine lying in bed after such a night. Your hair reeks of smoke. Your blankets carry the bitter tang of ash. Each cough leaves a trace of acrid taste on your tongue. Even your bed curtains trap some of the haze, turning your small sleeping space into a lingering reminder of the fire. The room may be warmer, but it comes at the expense of fresh air. Peasants fared no better. Many cottages lacked chimneys, so smoke from the central hearth rose into the rafters, slowly seeping through the thatched roof. Children grew up in homes permanently veiled in smoke, their lungs darkened before adulthood. Yet this was considered normal. Some even believed the smoke preserved the timber roof by deterring insects. Survival and superstition intertwined with every breath. The sensory impact was relentless. Soot particles irritated the skin. Eyes watered constantly. Floor rushes gathered black dust. Servants swept tirelessly, though their efforts often seemed pointless. Every winter repeated the same struggle, combating smoke and cold simultaneously, knowing that easing one problem only worsened the other. Despite the discomfort, fire was essential. No one could survive a castle winter without it. People adapted. They hung smoky tapestries with pride, endured fits of coughing, and scrubbed soot from their faces each morning. Warmth demanded a sacrifice, and that sacrifice was clean air. So as you lie in your modern bed tonight, breathing easily without a second thought, reflect on how extraordinary this comfort is. For medieval sleepers, every warm night meant another smoky morning. Dreams were steeped in the scent of burning wood. Lives lived under a constant haze of soot. When fires dimmed and the night stretched on, the only remaining light in a medieval chamber often came from a candle. This flame might seem decorative, a touch of ambience, but for many it was also a fragile source of warmth. A single wick could not heat a whole room, of course, but in a world where every flicker mattered, even the smallest glow contributed. Candles took many forms. Wealthy households used beeswax, producing a bright, clean flame with a faint honeyed scent, expensive and reserved for chapels, ceremonies, or noble chambers. Most people relied on tallow candles made from rendered animal fat, which smoked, sputtered, and released a greasy odor. Imagine falling asleep with the acrid smell of burning tallow mingling with the damp stone and wool around you. Candles were not just for light, they provided noticeable warmth nearby. Place one close to a bed curtain, and the fabric might feel slightly warm. Some households arranged multiple candles on stands, creating small clusters that offered both illumination and a pocket of heat. It was far from central heating, but it softened the harsh edges of winter around the immediate area. One 14th-century letter recounts a noblewoman demanding 12 candles in her chamber on cold nights, insisting that she could only rest with that many flames. Servants complained about the extravagance, But the request illustrates a larger truth. Light served as a substitute for heat, even when the effect was limited. -19 candle flames were notoriously unstable, and bed curtains made of wool or linen were highly flammable. Historical records recount fires caused by careless candle placement, often reducing entire rooms to ashes. One grim story from Germany tells of a squire who fell asleep with a candle on his bed rail. He woke to find his blankets aflame and barely escaped with his life. While the servants blamed him for recklessness, the true cause was simple necessity. He had wanted a small source of warmth close at hand. Scholars continue to debate whether people in the medieval period fully understood these dangers, or if the routine use of candles led to a sense of complacency. Some argue that inventories of burned textiles suggest such accidents were common and socially tolerated, while others note that the wealthy mitigated risk by assigning servants to watch the lights late into the night. Either way, the struggle between comfort and danger was constant. Now, imagine yourself in such a chamber. The hearth fire has died down to glowing embers, leaving shadows stretching across the walls. A single candle stands on a wooden holder near your bed. Its soft, golden light forms a small halo, reaching your hands as you pull the covers closer. The gentle warmth eases the chill on your face. The flame flickers, wax slowly dripping down the side, and a faint scent of smoke lingers in the air. Beyond the curtain, the rest of the room fades into darkness. You hear the subtle sounds, the wick popping, the wind sighing against the shutters, the soft patter of wax on metal. Your world shrinks to this small circle of light and warmth. In this moment, the candle becomes more than illumination. It is a delicate companion, standing between you and the vast night. In simpler homes and inns, similar scenes unfolded. Travelers used rush lights, cheap candles made from fat, that burned quickly, unevenly, and with occasional spitting, yet their glow offered reassurance. Parents placed small lamps near their children to ward off cold and fear. Even monks, known for their austerity, allowed lamps to burn in dormitories, citing both safety and necessity. The sensory experience was vivid. The smell of melted fat and smoke, walls blackened by soot, bed covers stained by dripped wax. Yet people accepted these flaws. During the harshest winters, the candle was more than decoration. It was a tool of survival. As you rest tonight under your clean electric light, imagine the precarious flicker of a medieval flame. It gave just enough warmth to comfort the body, while each spark held the potential for disaster. Sleep in the Middle Ages was never entirely free from risk. Closing one's eyes meant trusting that the fragile flame would last through the night without turning warmth into ruin. Step beyond the noble chambers, and a different side of medieval sleep appears: the communal dormitory. Not everyone enjoyed heavy curtains, feather beds, or attentive servants. Monks, soldiers, apprentices, and servants often slept in shared spaces where comfort was secondary to endurance. Monastic rules, for example, required simplicity, which meant dormitories were long halls lined with rows of beds or straw pallets. Stone floors stretched across the hall, broken only by narrow, high windows. Each monk had a modest cot or thin mattress, sometimes just a wooden plank with a pad. Beds were placed close together, so one could hear the breathing of the next. Privacy was unknown, but collective warmth made up for the lack of comfort. Historical accounts describe these halls at night, filled with coughing, snoring, and the rustle of rough woolen blankets. The air was cold, damp, and heavy, yet the press of bodies made the dormitory warmer than an isolated chamber. One chronicler even noted that the cloister could be warmer than a lord's private tower, thanks to the bodies huddled together. 20 inches military air, but it is less harsh than in an empty chamber. Your wool blanket scratches your chin as you tuck it closer, grateful for warmth yet wishing for silence. The rhythm of the dormitory is distinct. Snores rise and fall like waves, broken occasionally by murmured dreams. Somewhere, a rat scurries across the rushes, the prickling warmth of a heated stone. You drift to sleep, senses full, briefly convinced that comfort is perhaps ignored by those too weary to care. Drafts slip through high windows, but collective body heat blunts their bite. It may not be cozy, but it is safer than sleeping alone in a vast stone room. Apprentices and household servants experienced similar conditions. Castles were filled with small side chambers and lofts where young boys or maids rolled out straw pallets, often under staircases or in storage rooms. Cloaks were layered, and people huddled together, turning modest spaces into makeshift bedrooms. Unlike nobles, they had no warming pans or feather beds, but their proximity provided warmth. Their quarters were smaller and more crowded, making them physically warmer. The sensory reality of these communal spaces was unforgettable. Rough wool against the skin, the musky scent of bodies pressed close, low breathing, straw scratching underfoot, and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. It was not peaceful in the modern sense, but it was endurance. Silence or solitude was not expected, survival was. Tonight, as you rest in your own bed, think of these long halls of monks chanting before lights were extinguished, soldiers collapsing in rows after battle, and servants curled together in hidden corners. Their warmth came not from silk or fur, but from each other. Sleep in medieval times was as much about community as it was about comfort. A reminder that, in even the coldest castles, survival was rarely solitary. Even within this imagined crowded dormitory, warmth was not guaranteed. Fires needed constant tending, and someone always rose in the night to stoke the embers. Medieval sleep was often interrupted, not just by discomfort or neighbors' coughs, but by practical necessity. The medieval sleep schedule differed from ours. People did not expect 8 uninterrupted hours. They often practiced segmented sleep. A first sleep occurred after dusk, lasting a few hours until around midnight. Then many awoke, sometimes to tend fires, sometimes to pray, sometimes for other duties. 21 inches medieval times, people often practiced what is now called segmented sleep. After an initial period of slumber, they would awaken for an hour or two, attending to chores like checking animals or children, before returning to sleep until dawn. During the coldest months, this interval frequently focused on maintaining the fire. Without constant attention, embers would die, and the rooms would become unbearable. A notable account comes from a 15th-century physician who suggested using this waking period for reflection, conversation, or intimacy. For him, it was a natural rhythm. Yet for a servant trudging across icy floors to feed logs into the hearth, it was more about duty than philosophy. They would listen to the crackle of new wood, blow on embers, and hope the fire would catch. Some rural records describe families sharing watch duties, especially in large halls, with each adult taking turns checking the fire. Monasteries also had a structured routine. Bells rang at intervals throughout the night, calling monks to prayer while ensuring someone stayed awake to tend the heat. Sleep was less a private retreat and more a communal rhythm, punctuated by responsibility. Historians continue to debate whether segmented sleep was universal or more typical in Northern Europe, where long winter nights made continuous sleep difficult. Some argue necessity drove the practice, while others believe it was a cultural habit, not entirely dependent on geography. Regardless, tending the fire remained central to these nighttime routines. Picture yourself waking in the dead of night. The room is quiet except for the soft rhythm of breathing. You push back the blankets, feel the icy air, and reach for a log. Your footsteps crunch on straw. Your hands sting as you stir the dying embers, sparks flying, logs catching slowly, warmth returning to the room. Relief washes over you knowing your companions will remain undisturbed for a few more hours. The sensory experience is vivid. The pop of wood, the faint glow chasing back shadows, the mix of smoke and wool, fingers aching but steadied by the satisfaction of reviving the fire. When you crawl back under the blankets, the bed feels warmer than before. Peasants in cottages followed the same rhythm. Without protective grates, their hearths held open flames, so neglecting the fire could be dangerous. Families ensured someone rose to poke embers, adjust logs, and maintain vigilance. Sleep was fragmented, always linked to the heartbeat of the fire. Medieval nights, then, were not passive periods of unconsciousness. They were carefully managed. People rose, worked, prayed, tended animals, whispered to loved ones, and returned to slumber. Life slowed but did not stop, illuminated by firelight and punctuated by breath. As you lie in a warm bed tonight, consider the constant vigilance required in stone halls of the past. Sleeping meant trusting someone would feed the fire, keeping the cold at bay until dawn. Beyond necessity, some medieval strategies for warmth were tied to luxury. Bathing, for example, was a rare indulgence. Heating water required significant fuel, and tubs were cumbersome. A warm bath was an event, often communal, but for those who could afford it, sinking into steaming water on a winter night felt magical. Chroniclers described noblewomen lowering themselves into wooden tubs lined with cloth, steam curling in the lamplight, attendants nearby with warm towels. Stepping out and sliding into bed offered a fleeting triumph over winter's cold. 22 sometimes tubs were placed near the fireplace so that bathers emerged into a room already warmed by heat. The air carried the scent of rosemary or thyme, herbs added to the water for fragrance and supposed medicinal benefits. For a brief period, the skin tingled with warmth, cheeks flushed, and the body felt ready for restful sleep. Of course, such luxuries were rare. More commonly, people sought smaller comforts before bed. A cup of warm ale, spiced wine, or hot mead was a frequent indulgence. The heat spread inward, warming the chest and lulling the body toward drowsiness. Some households kept stones near the hearth, wrapped in cloth, and placed at the foot of the bed, early versions of hot water bottles that radiated heat for hours. One unusual account describes noble families filling leather pouches with heated sand to slip between sheets. Sand retained warmth longer than stones and molded to the body's shape. Imagine stretching frozen feet toward such a pouch, feeling the cold slowly ease. The creativity is remarkable. Faced with harsh winters, people experimented with whatever resources they had. Modern historians still debate how common these bedtime comforts were. Were they rare treats for the wealthy, or did middle-class families enjoy simpler versions? Some suggest warming drinks and heated stones were widespread and accessible to many. Others believe they remained occasional indulgences, remembered precisely because they were unusual. This debate highlights that comfort itself was a privilege. Picture yourself in this imagined chamber. You sit by the hearth as a servant pours mulled wine into a cup. Cinnamon and cloves fill the air, masking smoke and damp wool. You sip slowly, warmth spreading through your chest. Your eyes grow heavy, your limbs relax. When you climb into bed, the blankets feel less oppressive, more welcoming. At your feet, a cloth-wrapped stone radiates gentle heat. For once, the night feels less threatening. The sensory details are vivid. The sweet tang of spiced wine, the hiss of a log falling into embers, sible. Yet these indulgences were fleeting. Heat faded, drinks cooled, and by midnight the room was cold again. What these rituals offered was not lasting warmth but psychological relief, moments that made the relentless chill bearable. Tonight, consider how deeply medieval people longed for warmth. They engineered clever solutions, sought brief pleasures, and turned even a simple hot drink into a survival strategy. Their nights were not easy, but they were inventive. Every bath, stone, and sip of ale was a small defiance against the cold. Even with baths, heated stones, or mulled drinks, people did not rely on physical measures alone. Cold was more than a bodily threat. It was spiritual and supernatural. Night carried danger. The air itself was thought to harbor illness and evil forces. People turned to charms, rituals, and superstitions to protect themselves while sleeping. One common practice was hanging amulets above the bed. Carved wooden crosses, small relics believed to hold saintly power, or herbs in pouches. Rue, mugwort, and juniper were popular, thought to repel evil spirits and poisonous night air. Imagine lying under a canopy strung with fragrant bundles, their scent blending with hearth smoke and the musk of wool blankets. Prayers served as another protection. Monastic rules encouraged reciting psalms before sleep, and noble families often repeated paternosters or maras at the bedside. Even peasants whispered charms, half prayer, half spell, crossing themselves against frost or danger. 23 Fever. Softly murmured verses over children, gentle kisses pressed to their foreheads, intended to ward off the night hag. a figure believed to suffocate sleepers. A curious detail appears in a 15th-century German household manual. Sleepers were instructed to place iron objects, such as knives or scissors, under their beds or pillows. Iron was thought to repel demons and fairies that crept in during the long hours of darkness. In the flickering firelight, the metal glinted faintly, a silent guardian against unseen intruders. Some rituals focused directly on warmth. One folk belief suggested that turning your shoes upside down by the bed would prevent frost from biting your toes. Another held that whispering the names of 3 saints before blowing out a candle would help retain body heat through the night. Today, these may sound like quaint superstitions, but to them, such practices were as essential as an extra blanket. Scholars debate how seriously these rituals were taken. Some argue that charms and prayers were heartfelt, integrated into the daily rhythm of life. Others see them as habitual gestures, performed more from custom than belief. Either way, the practices highlight a fundamental truth. Sleep was never fully trusted. It was a vulnerable state, open to cold, illness, and spirits. People relied on both physical and spiritual protections. Imagine lying in a medieval bed, curtains drawn, fire burning low, shadows filling the chamber. Above you, a sprig of juniper sends its sharp scent into the smoky air. Beneath your pillow lies a small iron knife, hidden but reassuring. You whisper a soft prayer, cross yourself, and draw the blankets tighter. The night feels less threatening, as though these rituals have formed a protective circle around your fragile body. The sensory details enrich the scene. The rustle of herbs against the canopy, the faint metallic scent of iron, the warmth of wool on your skin, the echo of whispered words. Faith, superstition, and survival intertwine. Peasants practiced similarly, though with simpler materials, crude charms, carved wooden figures, knotted cords, or herbs from the fields. Parents placed garlic under their children's pillows to ward off sickness and spirits. Even animals were included. Cows and sheep were sometimes blessed before nightfall, believed to strengthen the household against frost. Across all social classes, the cold night was met not only with blankets and fire but with ritual. Medieval minds sought warmth in the body and security in the unseen. To sleep was to step into mystery, where prayer, herbs, iron, and fire combined to protect against darkness. Tonight, when you tuck in, imagine those small gestures. Flipped shoes, sprigs of rosemary, whispered saints' names. Though intangible, they offered real comfort. For medieval sleepers, survival relied not only on physical measures but also on spiritual armor, woven from faith, habit, and hope. Step back from the bed and consider the chamber as a whole. Beyond blankets, dogs, and charms, the room's design shaped how well its occupants endured the night. Castles were first built for defense, but over time, builders experimented with ways to make interiors more livable, resulting in a patchwork of features. Some practical, some symbolic, designed to extract warmth from stone. One example is the solar, a private room for the Lord and his family. Unlike the vast Great Hall, the solar was smaller, higher in the building, and easier to heat. It often had its own fireplace, thick wall hangings, and sun-facing windows. This was not luxury in the modern sense, it was strategy. By reducing the room size, the fire's warmth could linger. Tapestries served more than decoration. Woven from wool or silk, they lined the walls, trapping heat and softening the cold stone. 24 tapestries in medieval castles were more than just decoration. They displayed color, stories of saints, hunts, and mythical beasts, but they also served a practical purpose: insulation. A single tapestry could span 10 to 20 feet and be so heavy that servants struggled to hang it. Behind the fabric, damp stone walls were concealed, and the air near the wall felt slightly warmer. Stand close, and the faint, earthy scent of wool, known as lanolin, could be detected. Archaeological studies show that wooden paneling was also common, serving the same function. Thick oak boards created a buffer of trapped air, making rooms feel less like cold caves. Servants stuffed gaps with moss, rags, or tow to block drafts. While far from perfect, these measures reveal the lengths people went to turn harsh fortresses into livable homes. Estate records reveal a curious detail. Nobles often transported their most valued tapestries from castle to castle, using them as portable walls. These hangings were more than art, they were essential survival tools. A lord traveling without his tapestries was considered as unprotected as a soldier without armor. Experts in medieval domestic life debate just how effective these features truly were. Some argue they significantly reduced drafts and retained heat, while others believe their psychological comfort mattered more. Entering a room decorated with vibrant cloth and illuminated by firelight might feel warmer, even if the actual temperature was little different. This tension highlights the delicate balance between perception and survival. Imagine stepping into such a room. The door closes behind you, muting the wind's howl from the corridor. The walls are draped in crimson and gold tapestries, their woven figures glowing in the candlelight. A fire flickers in the stone hearth, smoke curling upward. The timber ceiling above seems lower than in the grand hall, making the room feel more intimate. It is still cold, you see your breath, but less hostile than the larger chambers below. The sensory experience is layered. The rough texture of the tapestry under your hand, the faint smell of wool mingling with smoke, and the crackling of fire against oak logs. You can almost believe this room is a refuge, though the chill lingers just beyond the hangings. Peasants used similar strategies, albeit more simply. They plastered or wattle-lined their walls, then hung coarse wool or patched cloth to block drafts. Brightly painted fabrics with simple designs served as both decoration and insulation. In their way, even the humblest homes were transformed into protective shells, shrinking the space into something livable. Another subtle trick was placing sleeping chambers on upper floors. Rising heat from the great hall below offered some warmth. Children sometimes slept in lofts above kitchens, where lingering oven heat helped. These arrangements prioritized temperature over privacy, taking advantage of every stray degree of heat. Yet, despite all these efforts, the cold never disappeared entirely. Could only be mitigated, never fully overcome. Still, the combination of wall hangings, solar chambers, and wooden panels shows how deeply people sought to convert stone fortresses into homes. As you rest tonight, picture rooms glowing with tapestries, warmed by firelight, softened by wood and cloth. By modern standards, they were far from cozy, but they were acts of resistance. Against stone, frost, and the endless winter night, medieval households built layers, architectural, artistic, and psychological, to claim their space. Close your eyes and imagine the smell of a medieval bedroom. It was not the lavender-scented ideal of contemporary linens. Instead, it was a dense mix of odors greeting anyone who passed through the heavy wooden door. Understanding how people slept requires understanding these smells. Every breath was a reminder of the environment in which they lived. The first scent was always smoke. Fires burned almost constantly in winter, and without efficient chimneys, soot often drifted back into the room. 25 The walls darkened. The air grew dense, and odors seeped into blankets and curtains, lingering even on freshly washed linens. At night, smoke clung to your hair, clothes, and skin. Soon, a damp, woolly scent followed. Blankets, cloaks, and garments rarely stayed fully dry in winter. Moisture passed through stone walls, settled on surfaces, and soaked fabrics. Wool retained that persistent, earthy, slightly sour smell. Imagine pulling the covers up and breathing in fabric that felt warm but never quite clean. Adding to this was the scent of straw and rushes. Floors were layered with them, beds stuffed with them, and they rarely remained clean. Trampled by boots, dampened by spills, and invaded by mice, rushes became musty quickly. Straw mattresses initially smelled grassy, but over weeks, they absorbed sweat and decay, releasing earthy odors with every movement. A 14th-century household guide suggested sprinkling dried herbs, rosemary, lavender, or meadow herbs onto rushes to freshen rooms. For a few days, this masked odors effectively, giving an impression of civility. But soon, crushed beneath footsteps, the herbs lost their scent, leaving only the sourness of old rushes. Human odor added another layer. Bathing was infrequent, hygiene limited, and sweat constant. People slept in layers of clothing that carried the day's smell. Leather, wool, unwashed skin. Shared beds amplified these scents. Breathing the air of a medieval chamber meant inhaling other people's odors, which could be comforting or suffocating. Scholars debate how overpowering these smells were. Some argue medieval people, habituated to constant exposure, barely noticed them. Others believe they were acutely aware, valuing herbs, perfumes, and incense for relief. Inventories and medical texts support the latter. People complained about foul air, sought remedies, and took steps to improve their environment. This shows that smell was central to the medieval experience of sleep. Imagine yourself in such a room. The fire has burned low, leaving only the bitter tang of smoke. The damp wool blanket itches against your chin. Straw beneath you releases musty breaths with every movement. Rushes on the floor rustle as mice scurry through crumbs. Your companion exhales, warm but heavy with sweat and ale. Above it all lingers a faint trace of rosemary, now barely masking the medley of smells. The experience is overwhelming, pressing into your nose and lungs, embedding itself in memory. You cough, adjust your covers, and breathe shallowly until sleep finally comes. This was normal life. Peasants experienced the same, though on a smaller scale. Their cottages often shared space with livestock. Cows, sheep, and chickens contributed to a pungent mix that city travelers found unbearable. Yet villagers accepted it as part of survival. Even here, herbs were used, bunches of mint or chamomile hung from rafters, both for scent and to deter pests. For nobles, perfumes and incense offered some relief. Incense in braziers added sweetness, though it mingled oddly with smoke and dampness. Perfumed oils dabbed on linens or clothes created small pockets of pleasant scent in an otherwise heavy atmosphere. Still, even the wealthiest chamber could not escape the core odors of medieval life. So, when you picture sleeping in a castle, do not imagine crisp linen or fresh air. Imagine smoke, damp wool, straw, sweat, herbs, and animals. Every night, every breath reminded you of your surroundings and endurance. Smell was as integral to medieval sleep as blankets or fire. 26 and over time, the familiarity of these odors could bring a sense of comfort. Breathing in smoke, wool, and straw was, for the medieval sleeper, akin to breathing home. For them, scent was not merely a nuisance. It was part of their identity, woven into every night's rest. Beyond the smoke, damp wool, and musty straw, another element played a crucial role in surviving the night: food and drink. You might not think of supper as part of sleep, but what people ate before bed and the warmth it provided internally mattered as much as any blanket. In winter, households relied on hearty pottages, thick stews made of barley, peas, and root vegetables, slowly simmered in large cauldrons. These meals stayed in the stomach, producing a satisfying fullness that helped endure the cold. The lingering heat of the broth spread through the body, convincing sleepers they could tolerate a freezing chamber for longer. Noble households might enrich these dishes with meat, cream, or exotic spices, while peasants made do with onions, cabbage, and whatever scraps were available. One notable entry in a 15th-century English manuscript even recommends eating leeks at night, claiming they warm the belly and ward off the chill of death. True or not, this reflects how strongly medieval people associated diet with warmth and survival. A hot meal was more than nourishment. It was a form of internal insulation. Drinks were equally significant. Ale was the most common beverage, enjoyed by rich and poor alike. Served warm in winter, it filled the belly with calories and offered liquid comfort. For nobles, spiced wine or hippocras was a favorite, gently heated and flavored with cinnamon, ginger, and cloves from distant lands. It produced an aromatic experience that combined with the smoky chamber, wool, and ash. The sweet, spiced drink warmed the throat and left the body drowsy and relaxed. Records from the court of Charles VI of France show that the king's physician recommended hot meat at night to prevent chills from entering the bones. This concept is not far removed from modern habits of drinking tea before bed. Though medieval explanations used humoral theory, the idea that warm, moist drinks balanced the body's internal fluids. Scholars still debate how much actual warmth these drinks provided versus how much was a psychological effect. Ale and wine may have dulled perception, creating the illusion of heat, yet they also offered real caloric energy to endure long, cold nights. Likely, the truth lies in a combination: partial physical warmth and partial psychological comfort. Now imagine preparing for bed. A servant hands you a wooden cup of warm wine, steam rising and carrying the scent of spices. You sip, the liquid sliding down your throat, relaxing your muscles, making your eyelids heavy. Climbing into bed, the blankets feel less oppressive, more inviting, as if the warmth already resides within. For peasants, the ritual was simpler but just as essential. A bowl of thick porridge, made from oats or barley, lined the stomach. Families gathered near the fire to eat, their faces glowing in the flickering light, their bodies fueled for the night ahead. Children scraped the last remnants from wooden spoons before curling under blankets. The memory of food's warmth helped them ignore cold drafts sneaking through the shutters. Folk beliefs also influenced bedtime habits. Garlic eaten before sleep was thought to prevent frostbite. Whether this improved circulation or simply warmed the palate, the habit persisted. Farmers in particularly cold areas sometimes chewed cloves of garlic before bed, the pungent scent filling the room alongside smoke and wool. The sensory world of medieval bedtime food was vivid. The bubbling cauldron, the hiss of wine heating over the fire, the mingling sense of herbs and spices with damp rushes, the heavy weight of stew in the stomach. All of it was part of the struggle against the cold. So, when considering medieval sleep, it cannot be separated from the supper that preceded it. 27 food in the past was more than sustenance. It provided fuel, warmth, and even acted as a form of medicine. Without it, the cold felt harsher, blankets seemed thinner, and nights dragged on. With it, the body could endure. Each spoonful, each bite, became an invisible layer of protection, an inner shield against the freezing stone that surrounded people. Consider the most vulnerable in a medieval household: children and the elderly. Their bodies were less able to withstand cold and often suffered the most during winter. If a healthy adult shivered through the night, a child might wake with blue lips, and an elderly person might not wake at all. Survival for these groups required extra care, community support, and occasionally luck. Records from noble households show that children rarely had private rooms. They slept in nurseries near kitchens or alongside servants. Young pages and squires, preparing for training, often shared crowded quarters, their laughter muffled by blankets as night fell. The logic was practical. More bodies generated more heat. Infants were swaddled in multiple layers of linen and wool. Cradles were placed near the hearth or sometimes even inside the mother's bed, where her body heat protected the baby from the cold. One 14th century account describes a noble child laid in a wicker crib by the fire, wrapped in furs and sheltered under a canopy. Such details highlight the lengths families went to protect their youngest, though illness and cold still claimed many lives. Medieval parents lived with constant anxiety, fearing that winter might take a child during the night. The elderly faced similar challenges. Frail bodies produced less heat and were less tolerant of drafts. In peasant homes, grandparents often slept closest to the fire, while younger adults accepted colder spots. In castles, older relatives might be assigned smaller rooms or moved into kitchens during the coldest months. A letter from Burgundy recounts an elderly woman choosing to sleep in the bakehouse, noting that the oven's warmth restored some of her vitality. Medical texts from the period recommended specific precautions for the very young and the very old. Heated stones wrapped in cloth were suggested for their feet, and fortified drinks were prescribed to strengthen the humors. Physicians warned that sudden exposure to cold could be fatal, a stark reminder of the vulnerability of these groups. Historians debate whether medieval families treated children and elders with genuine indulgence or simply included them in broader survival strategies. Some argue that the emphasis on protecting them reflects compassion, while others note that high mortality rates reveal the limits of what families could do. This tension between care and inevitability shaped medieval views on age and childhood. Picture a winter night in a peasant cottage. A baby swaddled tightly, its tiny face barely visible. A grandmother snores gently by the hearth, her cheeks glowing in the firelight. Parents pull cloaks around them, ensuring they claim the warmest spots. Children cluster on a straw mattress, giggling until exhaustion quiets them. The room smells of porridge, smoke, and wool, yet the warmth of family togetherness prevails. In a castle, the scene differs but is equally vivid. A nursemaid rocks a cradle by the fire, humming softly while a child whimpers from the chill. Upstairs, an elderly noblewoman insists her bed curtains be drawn tight as a servant places hot stones at her feet. She clutches a rosary, whispering prayers against the creeping cold. In both settings, the youngest and oldest demand the most. Medicine of the time centered on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Physicians believed that maintaining proper temperature was essential to keep these fluids in harmony. Too much cold could congeal the humors, clogging the body and causing sickness. Medical texts from the 13th and 14th centuries abound with advice for countering nighttime chill. One manual recommended rubbing warm oil into the feet before bed to open the pores and dispel harmful cold. Another suggested drinking heated milk with honey, claiming it soothed the stomach and prevented the humors from stagnating. Warmth itself was treated as medicine, prescribed through food, drink, clothing, and even close contact with others. A particularly striking account comes from a French surgeon, who warned that sleeping in damp rooms could provoke melancholy by chilling black bile. He advised hanging tapestries, not for decoration, but as a medical precaution. Imagine being told that failing to decorate your walls correctly could affect your mood. This highlights just how intertwined climate and medicine were. At the same time, folk remedies were common. Some believed rubbing garlic or onion on the soles of the feet before sleep could block cold from entering the body. Others tied wool soaked in wine around their wrists. An unusual English herbal guide even suggested keeping a live rooster in the bedroom to draw frost away from humans. Whether anyone actually slept with a squawking chicken is uncertain, but the practice shows how desperate people were for protection against the cold. Modern historians still debate the effectiveness of these medieval health strategies. Some argue that oils, heated drinks, and herbal treatments offered real relief, improving circulation and providing psychological comfort. Others insist most were largely symbolic, serving little purpose beyond placebo. The debate continues, but what is clear is that people believed fully in the power of these nightly rituals. Now imagine preparing for bed under this guidance. You sit by the hearth as a servant massages warm oil into your feet. The scent of rosemary fills the room. You sip a small cup of heated wine sweetened with honey, feeling it coat your throat. A sprig of garlic rests near the bed, pungent and unusual, meant to keep frost away. You climb into bed, confident these remedies will protect your humors until morning. The sensory experience is vivid. The slick warmth of oil, the sweet tang of honeyed wine, the sharp bite of garlic in the air. Sleep was not merely a respite from discomfort. It was a form of nightly therapy against bodily imbalance. Peasants, too, had their own solutions. Women brewed herbal teas of nettle or chamomile for children, believing warmth prevented coughs. Men wrapped their legs in wool soaked in vinegar to maintain circulation. In cottages, these methods blurred the line between superstition and science, but they gave people a sense of control in a world where illness often felt unavoidable. Ironically, many ailments arose from the very strategies meant to combat cold. Smoke from fires irritated lungs, heavy blankets caused joint pain, and oily ointments collected dirt. Yet, in medieval understanding, 29 these were minor costs compared to the greater peril of frost seeping into the body. Better to cough in a smoky room than freeze in a clean one. So when you picture medieval sleep, remember it wasn't just a matter of enduring discomfort. It was wrapped in theories of health, remedies both strange and familiar, and a constant anxiety that kets, murmuring prayers, and facing mornings as harsh indoors as outside. Now, picture yourself not in a castle, but on the road, far from familiar chambers. Medieval travel was slow, grueling, and dangerous. Nightfall intensified the challenge of staying warm. Castles had fireplaces and tapestries. Peasants relied on their hearths, but travelers, pilgrims, merchants, wandering knights, had to find shelter wherever possible, usually at inns. The medieval inn was far from the cozy image we might imagine. Often, it was a timber building with smoky halls, crowded rooms, and beds shared by strangers. Guests could be packed 3 or 4 to a mattress, blankets stretched thin, privacy non-existent. Yet inns offered one crucial benefit: heat. The main hall fire burned for everyone, and bodies pressed together multiplied warmth. One 15th-century Italian traveler complained of vermin in the beds but admitted that the company of fellow guests kept him from freezing. Imagine crawling onto a straw mattress, squeezed between 2 strangers, the sense of ale and sweat filling your nostrils. Unpleasant, yes, but at least your toes survived the night. Some inns offered even stranger accommodations. Poorly equipped inns sometimes placed guests in stables. At first glance, this seems degrading, yet travelers occasionally preferred it. Horses and cattle radiated heat, and a stable full of animals could be warmer than a drafty upstairs room. Pilgrims on the Camino de Santiago sometimes chose stalls intentionally, curling against hay bales with livestock, their breath mingling with the animals. The odor was strong, but the warmth undeniable. In rural areas, hospitality often followed older traditions. Villagers were expected to welcome travelers, especially pilgrims or those carrying religious tokens. A peasant family might offer a spot by the fire or on a straw pallet. Warmth here came not from luxury, but from generosity and closeness. Travelers slept shoulder to shoulder with strangers, listening to the crackle of a humble hearth, the lingering smell of stew. A record from 14th-century France describes communal inns with long wooden platforms covered in straw, where dozens of travelers, men and women alike, lay side by side. The idea of strangers pressed together may unsettle us today, but then it was normal. Shared warmth outweighed any discomfort. Scholars debate whether such inns offered more comfort than castles. Some argue yes, though crowded and unhygienic, they retained heat better than vast noble chambers. Others highlight the risks: lice, fleas, theft, suggesting castles, cold as they were, offered greater security. Both views hold weight. For the medieval traveler, survival often meant choosing between cold isolation or crowded discomfort. Now, imagine stepping into one of these inns. The hall greets you with the roar of voices and fire. The scents of ale, smoke, and roasted meat envelop you. Space is cleared on a straw pallet, and you squeeze in beside strangers. The floor creaks, dogs bark, mugs clatter, but the warmth of the crowd relaxes your limbs. Later, when snoring replaces laughter, you feel the heat of bodies pressed close, embers glowing faintly in the hearth. It is not the comfort you know, but it is enough. The sensory details are vivid. Straw scratches through thin linen, heavy sense of sweat, and perhaps that is why legends of freezing nights persisted. They reminded listeners that castles, for all their strength, were not invulnerable. Stone walls could keep out armies, but not winter. In the long, dark hours, even the mightiest lord depended on blankets, fires, and companions, just like the humblest peasant. 32. As you imagine life in the medieval era, hold both truths together: the tales of those who fell to frost, and the quiet victories of those who endured. Every story carried a lesson. Respect the night. Guard against the cold. Never assume survival was certain. Eventually, you returned to the hearth, the symbol that held every medieval sleeper in its glow. The fire was never merely a tool. It was the heart of the household, the boundary between life and death on winter nights. Its light cast shadows across walls, moving like silent guardians, flickering and shifting as the flames rose and fell. To sleep in a castle was to live in constant dialogue with fire. You feared it. You needed it. You could not survive without it. The hearth dominated every sense. The crackle of oak logs echoed like a heartbeat. Sparks shot upward, leaving trails of light before vanishing into the chimney. The scent of burning resin clung to tapestries and hair. Heat radiated unevenly, warming your face while your back stiffened in cold. The hearth was a paradox: savior and tormentor, life-giver and smoky tyrant. For nobles, fire was a symbol of status. A roaring hearth showed wealth. the ability to command servants to gather endless fuel, even strip forests if needed, to keep flames alive through the night. Some households employed dedicated fire wardens, servants whose sole task was to ensure embers never died. Letting the hearth grow cold was not just inconvenient, it was shameful. Yet the poorest also revered their humble fires. Peasants squatted on earthen floors, huddled with family and livestock, watching flames lick rough logs. They laughed, shared stories, prayed, and passed bowls of stew. Their hearths lacked grandeur, but their comfort was no less real. In castles and cottages alike, fire drew people together and made sleep possible. A traveler in Germany once described villagers circling the hearth at night, stretching hands toward the flames, whispering blessings as if the fire itself were sacred. They believed the flames carried their hopes through the night, offering protection. This shows how necessity often blurred into ritual. Fire was not just warmth, it was spirit, memory, and faith. Historians debate how much of this reverence was practical versus symbolic. Some argue it was survival instinct wrapped in tradition. Others suggest fire held genuine spiritual meaning, woven into daily prayer and cosmology. Perhaps both are true. Medieval people lived close enough to danger that fire naturally became more than fuel. It became meaning. Now imagine yourself in your imagined castle once more. Bed curtains are drawn, blankets piled high. Outside, wind lashes the towers. Snow hisses against shutters. Night presses in with full weight. Yet in the great hearth, embers still glow, faint light slipping through curtain cracks. You close your eyes, hearing the low sigh of flames, aware they are the thin line holding frost at bay. The sensory experience is complete. The taste of smoke on your tongue,